Well, I welcome you here, and I'm glad to meet Ward. We have corresponded, and I could tell this was an unusual teacher. This was a teacher who was not content to take the knowledge that was in the books and just regurgitate it to his students. That he had his classes involved in the world beyond Mount Madonna. He used our work more brilliantly than anyone has used it. We pride ourselves here in my small organization on the fact that we don't just produce television. That television without legs has only lungs. It can only speak, but it can't travel. And if you take television and turn it into educational use, if you try to show that beyond the images on the screen there's a reality that young people can engage with, then the television serves a double purpose of both informing the viewers who are watching and then transporting the people who want to follow up on it to a different place and a different mind and a different idea. No one has done that better than your professor, your teacher. And I'm just glad to both meet you personally and to meet this generation of your students.
Well, first thing I want to do is introduce one of the first graduates out of my program, P.K. Diffenbaugh. He went on to Stanford and got his master's there. He was a Coro Fellow, and now he's talking about coming back to graduate school here in New York.
It's just such an honor to be able to be here, and you know, when I reflect upon my life, I can see a crossroads, even as young as I am, in high school, dealing with adolescence and dealing with just the tremendous amount of change that's going on. And it was through your interviews and Ward's teaching that really helped me kind of find a sense of purpose and meaning, and the notion that there is a community outside yourself and outside your immediate relations, and that a worthy purpose in life is to pursue your goals, but to give back to that community. I doubt you ever question if your work has made a difference, because it has, but if you do, I hope you know what a tremendous impact it has had on all the students that go through Mount Madonna.
Well, I appreciate that. The truth is that while I have an intuition, I don't know for certain that it's made a difference unless I hear from the people to whom it has signified. And we journalists are like teachers in a sense. We ride on the wind and scribble in the sand. And the wind blows and it's gone, and the sand moves and it disappears. It's only in the imprint that you leave on somebody else's life that a teacher knows he or she has signified. I do not believe in monologues. I do not believe in filibusters, although I was in Congress, and I do not want to dominate. I want to do what you want to do today.
Margaret Wheatley, author of A Simpler Way, wrote that we create ourselves by what we choose to notice. She goes on to say that we can never direct a living system, we can only disturb it. We can nudge, titillate, or provoke one another into new ways of seeing. Does this in any way describe what you're trying to do for our society with your work?
I certainly would agree that it's a consequence of what I do. Essentially, I do what I do because it engages me. But I think usually it's not what you notice, it's what notices you. That in some indescribable way, there are ideas, there are certainly people, there are experiences, there are moments, there are encounters that notice you, that shine their attention in some way on you. But yes, in a way she's right for me in this sense, that what I notice, I have a classroom television in which what I notice I can say to others, hey, pay attention. You too may be interested in it. I mean, this grabbed me, some book inspires me to want to talk to the author, or some incident compels me almost to want to do a story about it and find out the why behind what I have read. And once I do it, I'm able to put it in a forum, in a venue that has an invisible audience out there that responds to it. So I do believe that's what life is all about, that it is a constant interlocking of experience and ideas and personalities. Something close to what she said has been something of a mandate of mine. The editor of the first newspaper in America was a man named Benjamin Harris. He published a newspaper in Boston, I think it was, called Public Occurrences, both foreign and domestic. And he said that his mandate was to give an account of such considerable things as has come to my attention. And that's what I do as a journalist. I mean, considerable things come to my attention, and then I'm able to act upon them and transpose them into a form of storytelling, a visual medium. The root word of television is vision from afar. Television brings something to us that we might not go to ourselves. And then if it provokes us to get up off the couch or up out of the bed or up off the sofa or out of the chair and go out into the world, then it has served its purpose. So yeah, I resonate to what she's saying, although I'd never thought about it that way.
I was really inspired by your interview with Jacob Needleman.
Oh, yes?
And when he said meaning can come from the search for meaning, and questioning makes one open, makes one humble, it made me want to engage in more thoughtful questioning. And I was thinking that this is a good description of what you do, questioning. And I'm curious to know if the Needleman interview and the other interviews you have done have impacted you in a great way like that.
Well, you know, I just did a series, a 6-hour series called Becoming American, the Chinese experience in America. In that same series, I interviewed a young woman named Michelle Ling. She's 30 years old, and a Chinese American, a graduate of Berkeley School of Journalism, in fact. And she represents to me the quintessential American. And in fact, usually I start a series with a question, why or what? And I rarely get it answered because there's no simple answer to a question that drives a television series. But in this case, I did get an answer to the question. When I started out to do this series, I wanted to find out, what is it? What does it mean to be an American? Michelle Ling answered it for me. She's in the last part of the last documentary, and we're talking about her life, and she tells me about how she likes to eat chicken feet, you know, Chinese chicken feet, not very pretty. Not very attractive, but if you like that kind of delicacy, quite scintillating. She describes this to me in rich vernacular, and I said, but what does that have to do with becoming with the American dream? She says, it is the American dream that I can eat chicken feet. Then she pauses and says, but I don't have to. Nobody is forcing me to, and that's not my only option. So I can eat a McDonald's if I want to. Nobody's forcing me to, nobody's stopping me from it, but I can choose to eat. And then she goes on to make the transition to a very powerful point, that in America we have, if we're fortunate, and we are fortunate, the power to invent ourselves, to compose our own life. And that is very true. And how do we compose that life? It is by what we're exposed to, and then the choices we make of the possibilities that often and usually unintentionally open to us. We make a choice. In the same way that a composer takes this note and puts it with that note and hears the sound in his head and moves to the next note, composing a piece of music, we compose our lives. I mean, your life will be different because you chose to come to New York this week. Who knows how it will be different? And so can a life be deflected by often a bump you don't even feel at the moment. And so choices put you in the trajectory of bumps you may not ever know about until you've become a certain way, made a certain choice, emerged as a certain person.
Michael Nussbaum said in an interview, if you go into a situation with some fixed abstract principles and you think of the situation just as a scene for plugging in the principles, you very often are not going to see the new challenge and the characteristics of the person before you that you might have otherwise noticed. She wanted to say that Aristotle's directive is to think of yourself as though you're improvising. He compares this idea to what a good navigator might do. Now, in our preparation for an interview, we struggle a lot in planning and making a clear picture for our questions, and improvisation and spontaneity, and we were just wondering how you navigate through those two things.
That's a very good question. There are always two interviews. There's the interview the person with whom I'm talking wants to do, And there's the interview that I want to come out of there with, because having studied that person's work very thoroughly, I know there's some things that she ought to, that others ought to hear from her. And so I go in with 2 roadmaps. There's the big atlas, which is a familiarity with most of what, or much of what she has written, in this case of Martha Nussbaum. And I know she'll want to talk about this and she'll want to talk about that, and I should let her, because until she does, she won't join me on my roadmap. She will resist. I have to always be improvising, imposing my roadmap into, I have to embed it, current cliche, I have to embed it delicately into her, the interview she wants to give. And so that when I go to edit, I may have, 30 pages of a transcript, or an hour and a half, or in her case, 2 hours. And she has said in there what she has wanted to say, and then she said what I wanted her to say. And that's what I edit out into the second interview, which is the one I put on the air. All of your questions are quite good, because they are different nuances on the same theme, and that is, how are we living in the world and seeing the world? It is a dance, an interview. It is a dance in which the success of it depends upon acknowledging your partner, going with your partner, and then bringing your partner back to the rhythm that you hear, which is slightly different from the rhythm in her ear. And it's like every good dance, there is what Martha Nussbaum calls the principles. I call the music. And when 2 parties are dancing to the music, or when 2 parties are having a conversation based upon different principles, you nonetheless, by improvising, come to a place where both of you are happy with the results. And I've never interviewed anyone who has been happy with the results, even though they were surprised by what they heard when they watched. I think that life, I think the real phenomenon of life is change, is transition, and that everything else is background noise. And everything, politics, economy, the economy, education, I think everything in our life is background noise to the fundamental reality that from the moment we emerge from the passion of our parents and out of that fallopian tube and out into through the womb into the world and on through the rest of life until it's dust to dust and ashes to ashes, I think we're in constant change. Everything is background music, and we compose our symphony, our music, as we go along. That's why you can have strong, what Martha calls abstract ideas, principles, but you always have to be responding to the world as it is. And the challenge of an ethical life, I think, is to respond to the world from your principles so that you remain true to who you are, even as you are dancing to music you didn't compose. And that to hold to your principles while responding to change, flux, transition is the measure of an ethical life.
Well, we were watching your interview with Paul Woodruff, and that started us in a conversation about why it seems today's youth are disenchanted or shying away from traditional religion. And so I was thinking about that, and then I found this quote from Derek Walcott that says, if you're stuck on a moral center, what you want to do is give lectures and to give sermons. And that made me think that maybe the reason we as youth are shunning away from traditional religion is because we feel like it's too much of a lecture, and we're wanting more of a dialogue around religion. And so I know that you've talked with many very thoughtful people about religion, and I was just wondering what you thought about that.
Do you mind sharing with me your own religious journey, your own religious interest at the moment?
Well, I'm Methodist. I don't know, I'm trying to find my way through religion, or to a religion or a spirituality that works well in my life and that I can believe in right now. And I don't feel like I fully found it in the Methodist Church, or like I've fully been able to interpret the message of the Methodist Church as well as I would like.
And how old are you?
16.
You're 16. I'm 60 some odd years older than you, and I haven't found it yet. Although I came out of a culture quite like the Methodists. In fact, there were more Methodists and Baptists in the little town where I grew up than there were people. I started out with where the church organizes itself around a set of beliefs. I believe in God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Ghost. You know, so that religion becomes a series of assertions, a series of beliefs. There are some people who, you know, in the midst of crisis or in the midst of frustration or in the midst of despair, simply cannot wrestle themselves through to an insight that is comforting, encouraging, inspiriting. And they need to cling to what they have been told that sounds good. My father was very much that way, particularly after the death of my brother in 1966 at the age of 39. My older brother was my only sibling, was really my father's favorite, and he died. And I don't, of cancer. And I don't think my father would have survived if the church hadn't given him such sayings as, you know, in my Father's house are many mansions. If I did not believe it, I wouldn't have told you. Or Jesus said, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. And those are things that those were anchors to which my father could fasten his grief in a way that without exploring or without answering gave him comfort and consolation. So I have a great deal of sympathy for people who cling to propositions, to assertions, to bumper stickers, if you will, the bumper stickers of religion. But they get arrested there. And because they get arrested there, they never explore the deeper spiritual discoveries that are there for somebody who is open to experience. I said to Joseph Campbell in the series of interviews I did, are you a man of faith? He said, I don't need faith, I have experience. I have experience in the discovery of a personal sense of the divinity in the universe. It cannot be in the universe, cannot be labeled, cannot be sculptured, cannot be marketed. It is an experience that you discover as you open yourself up. I have one of my favorite interviews this Friday night on Now with the religion scholar Elaine Pagels. She's just out with a new book called The Gospel of Thomas, Beyond Belief. Elaine Pagels gives the best articulation of the difference between belief, which is I believe in this, and faith, which is in fact casting yourself into the experience and letting it shape you. Only by doing it, only by letting go can you really learn to swim. And only by moving beyond the assertions you've been taught to the experience of learning from your own experience can you really find that spirituality. So I think your generation is on a very good search, a difficult one. It's much easier to have that roadmap I talked about.
When we went to Washington, D.C. last year to interview different people in the government, we asked them our favorite question, which was, how can we make America more of a learning culture than a teaching culture?
In a culture, a society that is so filled with propaganda in which everybody has a spin on things, it's very hard to develop the capacity for learning, which is the capacity for listening, which is the capacity for growing in response to what you listen by rejecting what you think isn't valid for your life and accepting what is and weaving it into the fabric of your own destiny. I don't have an answer to that question of how we move from a teaching culture where everybody has something to tell somebody else, a propaganda culture or a teaching culture, to a culture where we have developed this capacity to learn. I mean, obviously without flattering you, I think that's what you all are doing. You're trying to create a learning culture in your life where you receive, assess, and weigh and organize what you hear. How we do that on a mass scale, how we do that in larger schools or publicly funded schools that are where the kids have to bring all the unfinished business of home and street to the classroom, I don't know. And how we do that in a society where money has become the chief, has long been the chief measure of politics? I don't know. This is one our generation hasn't figured out, and perhaps yours will. You know, America is a society where it thinks it has answers, and if you have answers, you want to give them to your class or to your congregation or to your readers or to your audience. And learning really believes with asking questions, and we're not very patient in America with questions because we already know the answer we think you have. This is my problem with both left-wing ideology and right-wing ideology. They think that they have the answers. And so why do they need to have a learning culture when we can just give you the answers, you appropriate them, and go and do likewise? I mean, it's frustrating. In my own journey, I mean, people are always saying, well, Moyers is a political liberal, and people mean different things by that, but what they mean is, well, I believe in government programs. That's not it at all, although I do believe in certain government programs. But for me, a liberal never accepts anything he hears from any authority uncritically. That means the church, that means the party, that means the government, that means the university. Any authority has its own ingrained goal and set of values, and it wants you to see the world through those goals and that frame of value. Now, they may be worthy, but they may not be. But what makes a truly thinking person, I think, is not to accept what you hear cynically, not to disbelieve that there's a value in what you hear, but is to never accept uncritically anything you hear from any authority, because authority by its very name presupposes an investment of credibility that needs to be challenged before you accept it. And I think that's ultimately what creates a learner, is someone who's willing to accept, is willing to resist the temptation to accept uncritically what authority tells you. Now, you can't reject it altogether, because then you have a society of kind of anarchy. But you need to really examine the propositions that are presented to you from the people who are trying to teach you.
I'd like to ask you a question about your interviews with Joseph Campbell. Each time I watch them, it seems that I learn something new, but perhaps more importantly, I realize there's so much more that I don't know. It moves me to search. But the last time I watched it, he talked about creating the need for America to create a myth, a modern myth. And when you pressed him about how could we do this, it seemed that he said it's too hard in our fast-paced society. We're moving too fast to create new myths. And I wondered that it seems from my perspective that September 11th, at least for a brief moment, America stopped to reflect. And I'm wondering what opportunities you feel September 11th has given us to kind of recreate ourselves, and who is taking advantage of those opportunities? Which leaders do you see taking advantage of those opportunities?
What Joseph Campbell talked about when he talked about myth, he meant what's the truth people live by, and we need to arrive at a new truth for America, a new narrative for America, a new story about America. The old story doesn't work anymore. It was a story that was never resolved. Here was a nation born in liberty and yet cradling slavery in its birthplace. We never reconciled those irreconcilable differences between the Declaration of Independence and the reality of slavery, the proclamation of our abstract ideals or our basic truth, with the reality of how we, North and South, were exploiting the labor of others. We covered it up. The Civil War was a great renting of that mythology, and yet after the Civil War, in practical ways, we didn't learn the lesson. We were not a learning culture, to go back to the earlier question. 9/11 gave us the chance once again to learn that we're not invincible, that we're not isolated, that we are in the world in a both dangerous and in dangerous ways, and how do we connect to the world in a way that enables us to write a new narrative of America as part of the world, not apart from the world. And I don't see, I mean, I see sketches of that. I see drafts of that being done in one book or another book, but no one has yet struck a note that I think offers a common resonance to people. Bush has gone to the, you know, it's us versus the world, and we must act militarily in order to defend ourselves, and that has put the rest of the world on the defensive. We have not yet. We haven't found the new story.
What brought about the transition from your work inside the White House to doing interviews like the ones you did with Joseph Campbell, and what is it about Joseph Campbell that inspired you to delve so deeply into his work and ideas?
Well, I've had a checkered life. I mean, although there has been, for all the improvisation and contingency of it, a common theme. I knew when I was 15 that I wanted to be a journalist. And I went to work on June 5th, 1952, as a reporter on the little newspaper in my hometown. And a series of unexpected events led me on a circuitous route that wound up with my working for the Kennedy-Johnson administration in the campaign of 1960, and then in the Peace Corps for 3 years, and then I was in Texas at the time of the assassination, came back on President Johnson, the new president's plane, and was for 4 years one of his closest associates. But I never lost that unspeakable interest in journalism. And I used to be, I was press secretary for a period of 17 months. And I kept thinking as I was conducting briefings at the White House, being asked questions, that I should be on the other side of the desk asking the questions, not answering them. It goes back again to the question about teaching or learning. And so an opportunity came up, quite unexpected, to become publisher of a newspaper in New York. How it happened? The owner of this newspaper, watching my briefings, took a liking to me, and for some reasons thought that I might make him a good, he was an old man, 80 years old, he needed help, he thought he and I would connect. So I actually was looking forward to leaving the White House and getting back to journalism, so I came to publish the paper. Published the paper 3 years, it was sold. I didn't know what I was going to do. Again, being noticed, an old friend of mine, I hadn't seen him in years, was editing Harper's Magazine. And he asked me, called me up, said, "What are you going to do?" And I said, "I don't know, I'm out of work." And he said, "Why don't you go on the road? Spend 3 months traveling the country, and I'll give you the cover of the magazine. And we'll call it Listening to America." And we did. If you look at Harper's Magazine, November 1970, you'll see the back of a bus with Moyers as the license plate, and the title of he gave me the whole piece, the whole magazine called Listening to America. They turned that into a book. It became a bestseller. Somebody at the old educational television station in New York called Channel 13 at that time, up at 304 West 56, noticed me, noticed that article. They were starting a weekly broadcast called This Week, and they needed a reporter and host, so they reached out and asked me to do it. I hadn't done television except the briefings at the White House, but I said yes on the spur of the moment. And it was a weekly half-hour broadcast with produced reports. And in the second season, I wasn't very good at the first season. I was stiff, formal. I still had on horn-rimmed glasses. I was still Mr. Official, as I had been at the White House. And I said, this is not for me. I'm not going to make it in television, but by God, I'm not going to quit after a failed season. So I said, I'll come back for one more year. I changed the name of the program to Bill Moyers' Journal. We ran out of money, and I brought in a new executive producer who had been the manager of the NBC Symphony when it was at its height. And he was given to artistic issues. And so he was sitting in front of my desk, and we were trying to think, how do we do inexpensive shows and finish this season on budget? He said, you know, I've noticed that you listen to people well. I don't know why that is. I could discuss that a little later. But, you know, I'm looking over your shoulder, I'm seeing a book by Barbara Tuchman. Barbara Tuchman was one of the great historians of my time. And he said, she lives over in Park Avenue, why don't we go interview her? So I called her up, and she said, sure. And we took 2 clumsy old cameras, because we shot on film then, not in tape. We shot on film, and had to run the big wires, you know, the size of your body, up the building, and we did that interview, and we put it on there, and it clicked. It worked. Got a great response, and I liked doing it. And I just kept doing it. Joseph Campbell was not a particular compelling figure for me. I'd heard of him, read him. I'd read his book, The Hero's Journey, at the University of Texas. He taught 38 years at Sarah Lawrence, and he held his classes, all women in those days, mesmerized by his teaching. He was a charismatic teacher. He believed in the sharing experience, and that's what came through in the series. That's a long-winded answer to your question, is to say that there wasn't any guided missile that led me to Joseph Campbell. It was a life's process of being both open, unlucky, losing a job, losing a newspaper, and lucky, somebody noticing me, you know. And but Campbell was a great teacher, and he taught me several things, one of which is that when you leap, very often the universe responds with invisible hands that catch you and transfer you, transform your life, turn you in a different direction. And that happened to me at a series of points. It wasn't any great epiphany. There was no moment of revelation, no aha, no eureka. But there was just a series of changes that were the result of my moving in this direction and somebody else moving me slightly in another direction. People love to listen to other people who have something to say. Now, they love to listen to people who don't have anything to say, or we wouldn't have celebrity journalism with all these interviews with celebrities on who never say anything. But one of the reasons I've done what I've done is that people who have nothing to say get the most airtime in America, whether it's politicians or celebrities. And the people who really have things to say, like Dewey Ming and Joseph Campbell and Barbara Tuchman and Martha Nussbaum, rarely get television time. And yet they can take you into a kingdom of thought that is so unexplored as to rivet you when you're exposed to it. And that's why I've kept doing it, even as I've kept doing documentaries. Yes?
How does your experience in the White House during the Vietnam War affect your views on government, how it works or doesn't work? And how did it affect your views on like military action as a useful government tool?
I learned less about government than I did about our society. I learned a lot of, it drove me back to a kind of journalism that I've been trying to practice, which is, you know, I said earlier, news is what someone wants to keep hidden and everything else is advertising. I grew up in the South. The South I grew up in was still a deeply racist, segregated society where people were in denial about race and slavery. And of course, in the 1820s and 1830s and 1840s and 50s, anybody who tried to speak the truth about slavery was driven from the classroom, driven from the newsroom, driven from the pulpit. And Southerners entered a kind of mass denial about slavery. Politics fail because you can't have effective democratic politics when people are in denial. And we had to go to war to settle the issue of slavery. Then it took another 100 years before we actually worked out the consequences of that war. In the Vietnam War, we drew our wagons together in a circle. We stopped listening to others, as we had done in the South. And both ended in tragedy. The denial of truth in the 1850s to the war, Civil War, and the denial of reality in Southeast Asia to the Vietnam War. So that, more than anything else, my White House experience has informed my journalist. I think it's made me a better journalist than I would have been otherwise. It's made me, as I said earlier, more critical of authority, not to take things that you're told on face value, So it's had that very powerful effect on my journalism.
We were watching your series on addiction, and you interviewed a family in which the parents were addicted to drugs. And when I was watching that, I felt really angry at the parents and kind of upset that they put their children in that kind of situation. And I was wondering if you have strong emotional reactions to the subjects that you cover, and how do you balance your own feelings with the responsibility to present that information impartially?
That too is a good question, and it's not easy. I do sometimes have very strong reactions, and yet I am there not to react, but to report. I always am responding emotionally, but I'm always trying not to pretend to be impartial. But there are professional tools you bring to bear in your work. A doctor can operate and not let the sight of blood sicken him. A doctor, a parent can change a baby and hold her nose, or his nose, so to speak. I mean, there are professional skills you bring to my work, and one of them is never to be surprised, or if you are surprised, never to show that you're surprised, or you'll lose the story. So yes, I get angry, and I used to get angry at people who were addicted, at alcoholics and addicts, until my own son turned out to be one. I mean, that series was done because I had a 30-year-old son. He was a brilliant journalist in his own right, married, upstanding citizen, promising young man. And at age 30, he disappeared. 30. Disappeared. My wife found him in a crack house in Harlem, got him out. Then he relapsed a second time, and we almost lost him. And then the third time he relapsed, I had to spend 5 days searching for him, and finally found him in a crack house in Atlanta. And with policemen with their guns drawn, we went in and got him out. And this time treatment worked. That was 12 years ago. And he's vice president of Hazelden, the rehabilitation center where he got his treatment. And what I learned in that experience is that addiction is a disease. You don't get angry at somebody if they have cancer or malaria or HIV. You don't get angry at them because they've got a disease. That's why I began that series with the first hour called The Hijacked Brain, because chemicals change your brain. And they change your brain so that if you have a tendency to addiction, if your genes and chromosomes react to want more, then sooner than later, the chemical changes in your brain affect your behavior, and you're no longer responsible for it. And you don't get angry at the person, you get angry at the disease. And that's what I learned from my 10-year experience with my son. And that's what we tried patiently to explain in that first hour through the use of neuroscientists and science. We tried to explain how the brain is hijacked by chemicals, whether alcohol and addiction. Why is it, I can have 2 drinks and stop. I never want more than 2 drinks. My son can't have 1 and stop. So his responsibility in the face of his disease is never to have that drink. That's the meaning of sobriety and recovery. He just says no, and he does. Because he knows if he has 1 beer even, he's gone again. And for 12 years, he's been able to exercise that responsibility. So I do have to try to understand who they are and why they are in order not to get angry with them.
Michael Josephson said in his interview with you, the most moving moment was having a child. When I compare how I was approaching teaching ethics to the law students with how I wanted to teach my son ethics and what I wanted him to be, I saw an enormous inconsistency. We know that your son affected your work quite a bit just from that, but in what other ways has it affected your approach and also the choice of subject matter that you've shown to the public?
Well, having a family has saved me from a toxic absorption with myself. It is very hard to put yourself first when you have 4 other people whose needs are equal to yours. I mean, the tendency to egoism is very powerful in a society, and it's never more pronounced than it is when you're on a public stage, as I am. And having a family has has provided me the empathy to see that other people's needs are often quite more important than mine. So it's kept a balance in my life. And I think it has affected many of the subjects that I have dealt with, such as addiction. I mean, and we did a wonderful documentary on the Families First, the effort to establish adoption for foster the children's program. I've done a number of things because of my experience as a father and a husband and a parent. Even my grandchildren saved me from self-absorption just because they are so indifferent to to my public notoriety. And because they don't even watch my television shows. I mean, and by the way, that's a moment. One night a long time ago, 25 years ago, the show was airing on Thursday night. I'd do the show and then go out and film for the next week's show or some future piece. I was flying back into LaGuardia Airport, 8 o'clock on Thursday evening in the winter. All the lights were below, the cars were moving, you could see just the hustle and bustle of this city. And I knew at that particular moment that my show was beginning to air. And I thought, my God, look at all the people who are not watching my broadcast. And that's a constantly humbling reality. Ralph Waldo Emerson, whom I'm sure you all have studied, said that all of life is transference. It's not creativity. Nothing is original. It is transference. And we humans live out our destiny that way. We dive and reappear. And I think that is true. I think ultimately it is all about a moral transaction. America is essentially a material transaction. You take $10 and buy something, you want to get something of value. I think on the level of the moral exchange, it's also, that is also true, that when people sit and watch my television program for an hour, they're giving me something they will never get back, which is an hour of their life. It is irreplaceable. It has been spent, and I owe them something of moral value in exchange. I feel the same way about a gathering like this. You're giving me 2 hours of your life, and you will never get those 2 hours back. They are gone. You spent them this way, and if there's no investment, you've wasted them. And only time will tell, but I feel deeply, as I know any teacher does, and I know as you do, that it is a moral exchange. If you spend 2 hours with somebody, you both have to take something away from it. I assure you that I take a lot of value away from this, the reassurance to an old man that when he leaves the field, he's not leaving it empty, that there are a lot of others he'll never know, lives he'll never see unfold, names he'll never remember, who are out there carrying on that, what I call the great transaction of democracy. And I wish all of you well.